Welcome everybody to today's invited lecture. I'm super happy to have Saif Mohammad here. Saif works at the NRC in Toronto, which is like a Canada. I wanted to say Canada, Toronto, in Ottawa, and which is like a university external research institution, like governmental research institution. But is already in Canada for a while. Did his PhD in Toronto. But started his career really in a computational linguistics domain, really about semantics, mostly lexical semantic, but also distributional semantics, word sense disambiguation. And I think you can also see this in the newer developments, like perhaps around 2010, where you started to look into sentiment analysis and emotion analysis. That's also where Saif made quite a set of very visible contributions with probably the most popular emotion lexicons, which are representations of lexical semantics. What I really like about Saif's work is that he really cares also about like contributing to the community, to the research community. I mean, I think his sentiment analysis work started a little bit with like participation in shared tasks. I remember how he said in an invited talk in 2015, a tutorial, an invited talk at the Wasser workshop. We won this shared task, so I thought that we need to continue with sentiment analysis or something like this. And but then he organized also a lot of shared tasks, which shaped like really the research development in the whole community in the last 20 years, I would say. Now he cares about emotion, sentiment, psychology, but also a lot about ethics and fairness in our field. Also contributed a lot to meta science work to study how our research community works and interacts. A lot of contributions to interdisciplinary fields like humanities, computational social sciences, etc. So it's really he's really like an important figure in the ACL community, and I must say that I'm very happy that you're here. I think that you are, at least to some degree, also responsible that I stayed in this emotional analysis field. So I'm super eager to see your talk now. So the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Roman. Thank you. That was probably the kindest introduction I ever got. I really appreciate it. You're too kind. I also thank you to all of you for welcoming me here to Bamberg, and it's such a pleasure to come here. I must say, Roman is one of my favorite researchers in NLP. Yeah, no, always very interesting work. I've always enjoyed his work. I've not seen him for a couple of years or so now, so I'm really looking forward to talk to all your students, especially, and get to know about all the things that you do. All right, so my talk today, I've called it NLP for Affective Science, and maybe somewhat grandiosely exploring fundamental questions on emotions through language and computation. Okay, this is going to be about an hour or so of talk plus Q&A, maybe a little shorter. But sit back, relax. I'll tell you some stories, and hopefully you'll have fun and find interesting things out. Right? But feel free to ask questions in the middle as well. All right. So another way to look at this talk is NLP for Affective Science, a window into emotions through language and computation. And I often use Nemo as my sort of mascot for emotions, because emotions, even though all of us are intimately familiar with them, we've grown up with them, we feel them all the time. But as soon as you try to get a handle on them, you try to define them, or you try to figure out how do these work, what's going on, what's driving them, how do they drive our behavior? Things get slippery, and so having a fish like Nemo seemed like appropriate for that, right? So in this talk, we're going to talk about how to get a handle on these emotions and affect through language and computation. But if you think more about it and you look deeper into the role that emotions play, you realize that by getting into emotions, we also get a window into our mind and also our body and our behavior, our health, and all sorts of things, right? So we'll get into those things as well. But before we get started, we should talk about what are affect and emotions, and maybe I have a little bit of a longer description here. Roman's group's probably much more familiar with these things, so if you know some of the stuff and you want me to speed up, just let me know. We've heard of things like emotion and sentiment, but fewer people have heard of things like affect, right? So I thought we might as well get into that a bit, and it is a little complicated. So affect, the way psychologists describe, at the very basic level at least, is like the basic sense of feeling. Feeling some things, we'll call that affect for now, we'll add to that gradually. Emotions are things like joy, sadness, fear, anger. These things are everyday people language. We know what these are. And to understand these things, I thought it would be good to go back in time a bit and look at how some of these theories of emotions have developed, because adding the context and the story helps us remember things. And we can go back a long way back, but I'll go back only a few hundred years to Charles Darwin, and he has done some work on emotions. The most famous work, The Origin of Species, was in the 1860s when it was released. But about 10 years after that, another book was released. It's called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And it's very interesting. And I was like, at first, I didn't realize why would Charles Darwin care about emotions. And it turns out it mattered a whole lot to him, because his theory was all about talking about how humans and animals are not that different. We've all evolved from the same sort of mechanisms. And so finding all kinds of commonalities across humans and animals was of particular interest. And in that space, he was looking at emotions and looking at how certain mechanisms of how emotions are expressed in animals and humans is very, very common. Like we purse our lips for some emotions, or raise our eyebrows, or, and things like that, right? So he did a whole lot of work in that space. And that's where some of the earliest work comes also about this universality of emotions, that is very common and widely applicable. It's not just for humans, but even for animals. But as time went on, you had cultural anthropologists like Margaret Mead, and the dominant theory in the 1950s was that these emotions are not all that universal. They're largely shaped by culture and society, and there's a lot of variation in how that happens. A decade or so rolls further on, and then you have Paul Ekman, renowned psychologist now, who at the time was a bit of a Sean Connery-esque character, right? So he comes out of the woods of Papua New Guinea. He says, look, people, I've gone all over and I've shown people photographs of facial expressions, and especially these 6 facial expressions. And wherever I go and show these facial expressions, everybody is very clear. This is anger, this is joy, this is sadness, and so on. For these 6 emotions, people are very clear and are able to recognize these emotions just by showing the pictures to them. And this is true even if you are in Papua New Guinea, where they have not had contact with the outside world. So it's not just like some contagion that has spread across the world. There's something innate about these 6 emotions. And so there's something basic and big about this thing, right? So this sort of energized the psychology community. And so there was a lot of work in that space. But then somebody else comes along and says, you know what, there are these 2 more emotions that are also basic. Or somebody else comes along and says, there are these 10 emotions that are basic, and so on. So there are a few different theories of basic emotions there. Parallel to this work is another line of work which I think is very interesting. And this started off first with Charles Osgood and colleagues, who in the 1950s did sort of like semantic differential experiments on adjectives. And they found that there were 3 core dimensions of connotative meaning. And these correspond to valence, arousal, and dominance. They call them slightly different names: evaluativeness, potency, and activeness, or something like that. But essentially, they map to the same dimensions, which in 1980s, James Russell comes along, and he's a very renowned emotion psychologist as well. And he's done some very influential work, and they found the same sort of thing, that if you do these sort of semantic differential experiments on these adjectives or emotion words and things like that, you come across these 3 very important dimensions: valence, arousal, and dominance. And so this is another way in which sort of the rich panoply of emotions that we experience is sort of boiled down to a small number of dimensions or categories. So valence is the pleasure-displeasure dimension, or positive, negative. Arousal is the active, sluggish dimension, and dominance is the powerful, weak, or in control of a situation, or the situation is not in control dimension. Right? So you can compare various words along these dimensions, and you can say, for example, banquet indicates a more positiveness than funeral. Nervous indicates more arousal than lazy. Queen indicates more dominance than delicate, right? And these dimensions are supposed to be orthogonal. You can be, you can be very positive and be very high on arousal, or very low on arousal. They're supposed to be independent. All right. And then some more decades further down, actually it's happened in 1996 or so, Lisa Barrett was a young undergraduate student at University of Waterloo in Canada. And she was doing some experiments on depression and anxiety, or some such emotions. And she was trying to replicate some of these experiments that Paul Ekman did way back in the 60s to see, how easily people are able to recognize these emotions. Like depression has a base in sadness, or anxiety and fear or something. And so you should be able to recognize these facial expressions in a similar way. But when she did that, she found that, there was a whole lot of disagreement. There wasn't this sort of agreement that, Paul Ekman's work had earlier claimed. And when she tried to redo the original experiments, she also realized that if you take away certain parameters and how those experiments were done, the entire structure falls apart and you don't get the kind of conclusions that Paul Ekman was getting. Now, Lisa Barrett has 30 years of experience in this field now. She's gone on to be a distinguished professor at Northeastern University. And in 2017, she posited the theory of constructed emotion, where she talks about how the brain constructs emotion. These are not basic or independent or fundamental units in our body, but that we construct these emotions. And the theory also, largely discredits some important tenets of that basic emotion about how, she's actually done these various experiments which show that you can't really recognize emotions very reliably from facial expressions. What you can get is some sense of valence, like, are you feeling positive or negative, but you can't really be very accurate in terms of anger, sadness, depression, anxiety, all sorts of emotions like that. That is simply a lot of person-to-person variation. A lot of stress on variability. Right? So, and one of the key things that she talks about is how we construct these emotions from these signals coming from inside our body. These are called interoception. How many here have heard of the word interoception before? Okay, yeah, one there. That's great. So, I hadn't heard of this until some years back, but it's a very interesting sort of concept. This is sort of a term given to the ability to sense signals from inside our body, and those signals particularly are called interoceptive signals. And according to the theory, our brain constructs these emotions from a few different pieces of input, but importantly from these interoceptive signals. So how do we construct this? So if that is some sort of external situation, let's say like right now I'm giving a public talk here in front of a bunch of people. This impacts certain aspects about my body. My heart is racing, my palms are sweating maybe. And then, and this results in a certain amount of emotions being constructed in my head, like anxiety or excitement. And that isn't a one-to-one mapping for different people. The same sort of interoceptive signals can be constructed into different emotions depending on their particular, past and things like that. Personality. So another example, you're walking alone at night, you hear some footsteps behind you, your muscles might tense, your heart rate spikes, your breathing becomes shallow, and this could lead to certain emotions being constructed like fear, apprehension, hypervigilance, and so on. You can have calming emotions as well, right? So let's put this all together. So affect is the basic sense of feeling that I said before. We get this from our interoceptive signals coming from our body. These are transduced and summarized, transduced as in shape and form, but also summarized. This is very important because our brains can't handle all kinds of information. We need to act quickly in situations of danger or other sort of situations of opportunity. And so these are summarized in some sort of way, and those signals that you get in the end are called affect, right? This is a feature of consciousness. It happens every moment, whether you're thinking about it or not, whether you're aware of it or not. And this sort of affectual signal is often described in terms of these three dimensions: valence, arousal, and dominance. Emotions, in contrast, are constructed in the brain. These are thought to be a little more, high-level cognitive processing involved signals. And this is created from affective and interoceptive signals, but it's also impacted by things like, the concepts of emotions that we've learned and understood from our culture, from socialization, and talking to people and so on, and also your predictive coding, the way the brain works. So the brain categorizes this continuous signal of affect that's coming, of valence, arousal, dominance, or whatever, and it categorizes them into these sort of, constructs of joy, sadness, fear, anger, and so on. And this is not unlike what happens for color, for example, right? So when we see the color it's not a discrete categorical signal, it's a continuous signal, but our brain creates these categories of green, red, yellow, and so on. All right, so So that's what affect and emotions are. Why do these matter? These are, as you may have sort of gathered from things that I've said already, they determine the human experience and behavior, they condition our action, they're central to organizing meaning. We saw that in how valence arousal dominance, for example, comes up in word meaning as well. Some people say there's no cognition without emotion. And importantly, I think it's a window into understanding our body, brain, and well-being, and also showing all these evolutionary forces that have shaped us into who we are today. So affective science is this interdisciplinary field that is focused on understanding affective emotions and understanding all these things that we talked about in the previous slide. How do they work? What are the mechanisms? Why do they work the way they do so, and so on, right? But also they help understanding things like mental and physical health aspects. And I like this last point a lot because looking at affective science and things like this helps us get agency into this thing. Our emotions, especially because of the way we construct them, these are not just passive reaction to what's happening outside. We have some agency in managing and regulating these emotions. So understanding these things can help us. So that is affect and emotions. And now let's talk about language. Language is particularly interesting, not just because we're in NLP, natural language processing, but language is a powerful mechanism through which we can express ourselves and express emotions, right? So and it's also a way, and it's powerful because we can express things in a very complex and interesting ways. And it's also usually, we use language to convey emotions with connotations and not denotations. We're not going around telling people I'm happy, I'm sad, but we are saying various things that communicate in some form or the other what our emotions are. And sometimes these words betray our emotions, even though we might not want to communicate these things. So we can see how language is very important. And so, and thereby it also stands that NLP for affective science can play a big role. Because we can, on the one hand, there are challenges, like because as I said, humans are very creative in how we use language to communicate various things, what we talked in the previous slide, but NLP can bring various powerful tools at hand, right? So for example, unlike work in psychology, for example, we can make use of huge amounts of large naturally occurring data, as opposed to asking people, how did you feel yesterday? How did you feel the last week, and so on? And that there are known biases and problems. We know that people are very bad at telling us how they felt a week back or yesterday and things like that. But if you use language to get at this, that can be very powerful. All right. So if we want to do NLP for affective science, a natural question then comes is what questions should we solve? What should we be working on? And on the one hand, it can be very tempting to take NLP and try and solve things that we find interesting in various ways. But I think it's also very important to go to this field of affective science where people and psychologists have been working for a long time, and they have all kinds of theories and they have great research questions that they know matter. And so we inherit a lot of their questions, and these are great questions to work on, like some of those things that I've listed above. But this is also relevant to linguistics if you're in language and interested in that, because language is used to convey these emotions. So how is language used to convey emotions? How does language impact our emotions? You can ask questions like this. And it's useful also in social science because emotions impact things like social contagion. They're relevant to morality, stereotype, behavior, and I'll talk a little bit about that work in the future too. And if you're interested in simply building AI tools, an important question is, how can we build tools that is useful to people, to clinicians, to social scientists, to psychologists to answer these questions and so on. All right, so that was the first part of this talk. I'll give you a quick outline. We talked about the core theories of affect and emotions. In the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about word emotion associations, because as Roman also mentioned, when I first started working on emotions, I worked on words. I thought it's a good, simple unit to start with. And I'll talk about more recent work, though, on anxiety and warmth and confidence today. And then we'll talk a little bit about emotion arcs, because these lexicons can then be used to get at various how emotions have this nice up and down flow in our lives. And so we can use to look at that. And our emotion arcs can sometimes be like that, or they can be like that. Sometimes life throws us a loop, and we have to deal with that. And sometimes you realize that, things that happen to us, the ups and downs, they keep repeating from time to time. So what can we learn about ourselves from all of these great emotion arcs? So, right? Lots of fun things to explore. Right. Yeah. So for this emotion artwork, the part I'll talk a little bit about evaluation, because even though a lot of people use emotion arts, there's not been much work on evaluation. And then I'll talk about the mind, the connection of the mind with emotion dynamics and emotion granularity. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the body and very recent work. It's in submission, really. And I'll end the thing with talking about some ethical considerations with emotional regulation work. All right. I'll take a sip of water, and if anybody has questions, we can just get into that. All right. So let's talk about word emotion association lexicons. These are simply lists of words and to what extent they are associated with various emotions like joy, sadness, fear, or valence, arousal, dominance. And I've been working in this field for long enough now, so I've created many different kinds of lexicons. Roman sort of mentioned the NRC emotion lexicon in 2010. That was long back. And then I had in 2018, I did this emotion intensity lexicon where you have intensity scores for them as well. I also have created the valence, arousal, dominance lexicon, which I think is very relevant, especially if you're looking in psychology and affect work. While if you're looking in digital humanities and looking at how people use emotions in day-to-day lives, the emotion lexicon, the categories there can be relevant there. We also have a word color lexicon. But today, let me talk about more recent work. Let's start with anxiety. This is a space that I was interested for a couple of years now. I feel it's a very important emotion. It impacts our lives in so many ways. It's defined as the anticipatory unease of a potential future negative outcome, right? So seems like a reasonable definition. And I want to mention first and foremost that it is a very common emotion. We all have it. And it's also a very beneficial human emotion, right? So, if you're in the wild and a bear might attack us, it's good to be anxious about that and take precautions. Right? That's why we've survived. If we didn't have it, we'd all be killed probably, right? So it's common, it's beneficial. But it can also manifest into mental disorders, right? And one of the theories going around now is that especially in the last 20 or so years, our human environment has changed so much with so much social media and dopamine hacking and all that going around, that there are too many triggers of anxiety in our lives. It's just triggering again and again and again, and that is leading to this sort of epidemic of disorders pertaining to anxiety and depression and so on. So like our evolution has simply not had enough time to keep up with this dramatic change that's going on around us. So why create language resources for anxiety, right? So this I think this is an interesting space because it can help us understand, what are the mechanisms of anxiety? How does it relate to other emotions and affect? How does anxiety relate to our body? How does anxiety change with age, with socioeconomic status, various other things? How can we identify useful coping mechanisms? All kinds of things can be determined if we study these sort of language. If we have these language resources, that allows us to study these kinds of things, right? We can also study how anxiety manifests in language, how language shapes anxiety, what are the cultural norms in different parts of the world in terms of how you should and should not express anxiety. You can use language resources to track degree of anxiety towards various targets of interest, like climate change, vaccines, immigration, hot button issues. You can look at when are we anxious, what are we anxious towards. You can develop automatic systems for detecting anxiety at sentence level, post level, so on. You can study the impact of anxiety on behavior, both in a physical and a virtual environments, which is a growing space right now. And you can study anxiety in stories and character development. What's the role that anxiety plays in developing compelling characters and storylines? Okay. So in 2024, I created a lexicon which had around 44,000 English unigrams and about 10,000 multi-word expressions annotated for degree of association with calmness and anxiety. We've got categorical labels, but also real value scores going from -3 to 1. This is done by crowdsourcing, employing a whole lot of good practices of interspersing gold questions and so on. Happy to talk about it more at the end of the talk if you're interested. And we show that the annotations are very reliable, which shows that people are very good at being able to reliably tell which words are associated with anxiety and so on. So what do you do with this thing? So I told you that you can do all sorts of things. I'm hoping a lot of people use it and explore all kinds of things with it. Some of the things that I did, went too fast. one of the things I did was looking at how do children acquire these anxiety words, So from the age of, 2 or at least 3 to the age of 17, we acquire a lot of vocabulary into our language, and there are, known data sets out there which say, at this age, people tend to acquire this vocabulary and so on. And you can combine that with worry words, this lexicon that I have, and then you can map out, what is the rate at which we are learning various anxiety and calmness related words. The anxiety related words are in this yellow orange, and the calmness related words are in the green. And you can see in the first 5 years, we learn a lot of calming related words. But then there is a steady drop off in how many new words associated with calmness we get, and a steady increase in all of these anxiety associated words, the reality of the world, I guess. Right. That's kind of fun. Another thing you can do, experiment we did in this paper was, how good are we at, just taking this lexicon and tracking anxiety in a social media stream, right? So let's say you got text about immigrants or climate change or whatever, and we have some goal labels of anxiety. How does that change over time? Can we use this lexicon and track that? Here we have the results for that. It turns out you can do really well. The yellow color is the gold arc for this thing, and the green is what you can get simply by counting up the anxiety words from this lexicon, and you can see you get a pretty high correlation of around 0.9. We show in the paper with experiments that if you don't use the anxiety lexicon and use a valence. Okay, let's move on. So next I'm going to talk about this work. It's called Words of Warmth, Trust and Sociability Norms for Over 26K English Words. This was just accepted at ACL. I'll be presenting that next week in Vienna. And even though the title focuses on warmth, if you've heard of this sort of space of work, you've probably heard of them together, warmth and competence. But I don't know how many have heard. How many of you have heard of warmth and competence, like as together? Yeah, one. Okay. So not very common, I guess. So, right? I mean, and I didn't hear about it until very recently either. So, but turns out it's very important. That is decades of social cognition and stereotype research from the 1980s, mostly led by Susan Fiske, very influential researcher in the field. She's recently retired. I was very glad to be able to just have some communication with her as well as part when developing this work. But there's this huge body of work on social cognition and stereotype content model and things like that, where they talk about how when human beings see another person or think about another person or think about another group of people, they quickly assess them along 2 primary dimensions. And that these 2 primary dimensions that we assess people on are warmth and competence, right? So seems pretty important, but yeah, not very commonly known, I guess. And again, a lot of this work is done using this sort of in psychology using semantic differentials by asking people self-reports, how do you feel about these groups, looking at descriptions and then doing sort of this sort of dimension reduction. And the 2 dimensions they come up to are warmth and competence. Competence is essentially the dimension of dominance. So, when they do the semantic differentials, you have a dimension, it doesn't really have a name. You just have some words that load highly on that dimension, and then some psychologists squints their eyes and they say, okay, I'll call this competence or I'll call this dominance, right? So the names can be different, but it's essentially the same dimension. It's the dimension of competence, control, power, strength, things like that. Or its opposite, weak, not in control, incompetent. Warmth, on the other hand, has things like friendliness, goodness, morality, gregariousness, integrity, and things like that. And some psychologists have further talked about how warmth should actually be modeled into 2 separate things, sociability and trust. And so sociability has friendliness, gregariousness, things like that, while trust has things like morality, goodness, sincerity, and so on. Okay, so, and if you look at some of this sort of psychology work, you'll see how this relates to stereotypes very quickly. For example, there's this work looking at, the image is not being shown over there. That seems to happen sometimes. Yeah, that's still further ahead. Yeah, now it comes up. So this is work by Kari, Fiske, and Glick from 2008. And it talks about how, how people perceive various groups. And this is for Americans and these stereotypes can be different for different groups, obviously. So Americans perceive themselves as being very warm and very competent. Okay, not surprising. This is true for all groups, right? You ask any group of people, their own in-group, they will perceive them as more warm and more competent. And usually people in the out-group are perceived in one of the other quadrants, right? So less warm or less competent or both. So according to many Americans in the studies that they did, so you would find people like homeless people or people on welfare or people from certain other countries or feminists would be thought of as, less competent or less warm. And once again, I stress these are stereotypes. This is not an inherent quality. This is just how people perceive them. And if you look at elderly people or disabled people, they are thought of as more warm, but not as competent, right? And if you think about Asians or Jews or rich people in America, they would think of them as more competent, but not very warm, right? So this is so you can immediately see how the sort of warmth and competence dimension can be a powerful tool in sort of understanding the sort of stereotypes that people might have. And so I was interested in creating language resources or this lexicon for warmth and competence, but more broadly here, I sort of motivate why doing such work is important. It impacts various fields because you can look at things like, what kind of warmth, competence, trust, and sociability assessments do children develop first, which is more important to us while we're growing up. You can look at it in social science, for example, for looking at level of warmth and competence in public discourse towards various targets of interest. You can look at it from a context of HCI and NLP from the perspective of if I want to build artificial chat agents, should they be having suitable ways of assessing warmth and competence in the conversations that they are having with things. It's relevant in digital humanities to look at warmth and competence with characters and intercharacter relationships. How do we build this tension? What's the role of warmth and competence in that? And you can explore things like that there. And of course, in commerce, that's very important as well, because a lot of these companies care about this sort of, how are people assessing my product or my brand? What's the warmth? What's the competence as perception that they tend to have? So in this work, we created a lexicon of 26,000 English words for warmth. And specifically, I decided to create a separate lexicon for sociability and a separate lexicon for trust. And then you create a union for warmth as a whole. The 26,000 words is a subset of the 44,000 words from the NRC VAD lexicon version 2, which has this 44,000 words now. And I chose a subset because I chose most of the non-neutral words, although I did include some neutral words as well, just to get more, bang for the buck of the annotation, so to speak. And we do the usual thing about making sure the annotations are highly reliable and so on. And as part of the distribution, we release warmth, trust, and sociability lexicons, but we also add in the competence, which is essentially from the dominance part of the NRC VAD lexicon. So you have warmth and competence, and you can do fun things with it. This here quickly shows you the distribution of the 26,000 words along these different levels of warmth, sociability, and trust. And you can see it's, neutral might be a significant chunk in many of these lexicons, but non-neutral things, there are a whole lot of words that hit those associations. Okay, and in this particular paper, I did a couple of experiments. One of them is similar, like in the anxiety one. At what rate do children acquire this warmth and competence and sociability and trust as we are growing up? Do we learn more warm words first, or do we learn more competent words first? And do we learn more high warmth or low warmth words first, right? And so these graphs show you that. So it turns out we learn a lot of high warmth words in the beginning. That makes sense. You treat your babies and infants with a lot of love, and you say lots of nice, positive, high warmth words to them. But as time goes on, that the vocabulary of that, comes down, and we learn more and more low warmth words or cold words as time goes on. If you break it up into sociability and trust, sociability essentially mimics warmth, but trust is interesting. Trust also, we learn a lot of high trust words in the beginning, but it doesn't fall off as much as warmth falls off. It stays steady for a bit and then goes down. Low trust increases with age. Competence is it's sort of the opposite. Right at the beginning, we are learning lots of low competence words. I don't know what to make of that, but we do learn a lot of low competence words in the beginning that comes into our vocabulary. And as time goes on, we learn more and more high competence words. That doesn't surprise me too much because we are learning more and more technical jargon maybe, and a lot of this assertive jargon, and you get more high competence words. Another thing that I did in this thing was look at the sort of warmth and competence stereotypes thing in this a bit. And you can look at this sort of stereotypes in two different ways using the lexicon. So let's say you've got a particular target. Let's say we have immigrant as our target word or concept, and we want to understand warmth and competence towards it. I can look it up in my lexicon directly and try and get a sense of, what is the warmth and competence score that people have said for this thing. Or I can look at natural language text, like let's say social media text, and look at when people have used the term immigrant, what are the words that are around it? And what is the warmth and competence associated with those words, right? And so I'll call this the direct method and the co-term or the co-occurring terms method. And so we did some experiments using American and Canadian geolocated posts from Twitter from 2015 to 2021. About 3.1 million of them. And interestingly, if you take the average of the warmth and competence of this large collection of tweets, we see that warmth averages at around 0.5 in a range from -1 to 1, showing that in language, we have a clear bias towards using a certain amount of warmth words in general, right? So that's fairly standard. If you look at a lot of related work, you'll find we tend to use these positive words in general. And the competence averages at 0.13. So it's much lower, though still in the positive side. It shows you that, we don't tend to use a lot of high competence words all the time, but we do use a lot of warmth words. And before I show you some of the graphs, again, a quick warning, these are associations and stereotypes, not inherent properties of the terms that I'm mentioning. They're there to study these stereotypes, right? I'm using this general purpose large lexicon. You shouldn't go and use this lexicon for individual utterances in certain domains where it might be used in a different way, language and things like that. So always be careful about things like that. All right, so let me show you one of these graphs that we found. This one here is by directly looking up the lexicon, and we are looking at various relationship words, right? So father, mother, husband, grandfather, sister, brother, son, and so on. And what we notice from here is that if you look at the warmth dimension, then everybody is at roughly the same level, right? So if you ask people how warm are these concepts, they're like, yeah, they're all very warm, compared to everything else, they're very warm. But if you ask people in terms of competence, you do get a spread. People do see this spread out. And you see traditional gender stereotypes reflected even when you ask people directly, right? So that male counterparts tend to be marked as higher competence than female counterparts. The graph on the right is when you use the co-occurrence of the word. So if you take these same words and look at social media data, Twitter data, and look at the words around co-occurring with these words, and then you take sort of average out their warmth and competence that you get, this is the graph that you get from that. And now here you see that you get a spread not just for competence, but also for warmth. That, we might think of them as all very warm, but when we use social media language, we do actually use there are systematic differences in the amount of warmth words we use co-occurring with these different terms. And once again, you get certain standard, gender stereotypes reflected again in this right side as well. Oops, okay, here's another one where we are looking at certain social groups. And you can see stereotypes, like, again, these are American stereotypes because these are tweets from US and Canada. And you see Muslim, Jew, and immigrant, we generally marked as low warmth scores, reflecting the standard stereotypes in the US and Canada. You have things like elder and overweight getting low competence, but moderate to high warmth scores. This maps very well with the traditional psychology research as well with self-report data. The thing about God seems kind of fun. If you ask people, God is high competence and high warmth, it's great, yeah, it makes sense. But if you look at how God is actually used in language, falls off a bit in some of these dimensions. I'll also mention, the term you use to look at it can be reflective of these scores. Like if you look at LGBTQ, for example, gets very high confidence and warmth scores. So why is that? We know there are negative stereotypes towards these groups out there as well. But my hypothesis is that one of the things that matters in language is what is the word people are using. The group of people who views them negatively, tends to use different, more demeaning words for them. And while the people who use LGBTQ generally use more high warmth and high confidence words. So again, things to be careful about in how you interpret these results. I like this graph as well. It's kind of fun. It's a simple one where it shows the in-group, out-group dynamics a little bit. It's a little complicated, but bear with me. In the red dashed lines are the average scores of warmth and competence for Canadians. So if you take all the tweets by Canadians, that's the average warmth and competence, and the blue lines is the average for Americans. And you can see that Canadians in general use more high warmth words and use more high competence words in that tweets in general. And the difference is substantial, marked, right? So that's kind of fun that there's this big difference in how Canadians and Americans use language. But then we can also look at when Canadians mention Americans, what kind of language do they use? And when Americans mention Canadians, what kind of language do they use? And when Americans mention Americans themselves, what kind of language do they use, right? And so those are those other class. And what you find is that posts by Canadians in general, they view themselves as being higher warmth and more competent than posts by Americans. So there's more warmth and confidence in those things. And that's standard in-group bias thing, right? So that's what you would expect. In contrast, Americans view themselves as more competent than Canadians, also standard in that thing, but they too view Canadians as more warmer than themselves. So in this case, the Canadians are nicer stereotype is stronger in Americans than even the in-group bias for warmth particularly. So even Americans view Canadians as warm. All right, so that was something we did with those warmth and competence things, and I talked about these two lexicons. Now I'll talk a little bit about these emotion arcs. So any questions on that so far? Yes.
I'm very interested in the gender bias in the warmth and competence, and I also considering if there's a correlation between the gender bias and the employment status or occupation area, how they associated and contribute to the warmth and competence difference.
Oh yeah, that's a fun thing to look at. I haven't looked at it particularly myself, but I know, was it Dan Jurafsky, I think, who may have talked about this in some earlier work, where they were talking about how in various professions, when professions are female dominated, those professions tend to be having low wages. And they're also considered to be not as important by community at large and things like that. Right. And but when women get into other professions which were traditionally male dominant, then and let's say they become, it becomes more female dominant. Again, there is the sort of social tendency to now view this other profession as not being as important. And again, the wages going down. So there are these strong stereotypes out there, and they're associated with professions, as you've said, and one can certainly look at that. I think looking at it from a warmth and competence perspective makes a lot of sense, because I don't think people have looked as much in NLP, at least and looking at ecologically, like this traditional social media data and things from that perspective. I know psychologists must have looked at it from self-report data. It's an interesting space to look.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, let's get into emotion arcs. So I think emotion arcs are very cool, and they are useful in a lot of fields, including in commerce, because we care about, how do people feel about my particular product? Is the anger or frustration or excitement going up and down? It's useful in psychology because people care about how people feel over a long period of time, and we'll come to that more work on that a bit. And it's useful in stories because, stories have emotion arcs or character arcs and things like that. So this thing by Kurt Vonnegut is very famous. If you haven't seen it, go see a video about it. He's very funny how he talks about it. He talks about how stories can have you can be a man in the hole or Cinderella arc. They're sort of prototype story types for this. And way back in 2011, after I created the lexicon, I thought it would be nice to showcase the power of the lexicon by creating these emotion arcs for these stories. And I published this as a workshop paper. It didn't really even have an evaluation because it's really hard to ask people to annotate these sort of things. That's why I sent it to a workshop, I guess. But this paper is very well cited now, and there's this whole line of work on looking at arcs of emotions and all kinds of implications for that. And I want to quickly mention here this, that you can do this sort of create these emotion arcs using machine learning. You can use your latest and greatest transformers, or you can simply count things up using a lexicon. There are some pros and cons to these different methods. The transformers are very good at giving a sentence, finding all these long distance dependencies, and being very accurate at sentence level. The lexicons might not be as good as that, but they have other benefits, like they're simple, interpretable, low carbon, domain free. And this is a low barrier for a lot of people in various other fields who are not programmers to be using these sort of things. But let's come back to this. Talk about the evaluation. I showed you an evaluation earlier on, but it turns out there's not much evaluation on emotion arcs out there. That's very little we found. If you have more, tell me later about it as well. And that's good reason, as I said, because asking people to read, 300,000 sentences and draw this emotion arcs, or even, tell me the emotion arc for Harry Potter, even a book you know the story of, it's not straightforward, right? But I'm very happy to report that a couple of years back, Daniela Teodorescu and I did this work where we made use of existing emotion data sets, employed some clever hacks to create these sort of emotion arcs of all kinds of complexities, and create that board arcs from these existing sentence label data sets, and then evaluated a whole bunch of methods on a whole bunch of languages and a whole bunch of affect categories to see how well you did. And I showed you the one for anxiety before, but here's one for valence. The yellow is the bold arc, the green is the predicted arc, using simple valence lexicon word counting things. And again, you can see, as long as your window size for each point that you're counting, so let's say, you're tracking emotions towards the iPhone, and every day you have 1,000 tweets, that gets converted to 1 point of valence. And then next day, another 1,000, it's 1 point. So as long as that window size is at least a few hundred tweets long, your accuracies can be very good. In this case, that is over 0.95 correlation, right? So, and that part is important because you want to see, this lexicon methods might not be very good at given one sentence to figure out what your emotions are going on there, but they're very good at tracking this emotion arcs over a period of time with a whole bunch of text. So that's easy. And it's not to say that transformers are bad. They're also very good. It's just that once you go to over 0.95 correlation, there's not that much room left to go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about the mind and body things, right? So I promised you some of that stuff. So let's first, I want to talk about a little bit about emotion dynamics. This is a concept from psychology, and I have to credit my student Will Hibson. He got me interested in this thing. He was not my student. He was a student I worked with. He was in the psychology department at Carleton at the time. And he told me about how in psychology, they talk about different people having different states. So for example, Roman, as you all know, is a very cheerful guy. His home state is high cheerfulness. Well, let's say I am like, lower in cheerfulness. And then if something happens, we can go out of our home state. But it's not where we stay all the time. That's not how our bodies are designed. We come back to our home state as to where it is. But again, our characteristics in all of this can be different, right? So Roman might bounce, if a negative thing happens, he might bounce back quickly to his home state. While for me, it might take a lot. Well, I know that person asked me this question and it was like bothered me. And then it takes a long time for me to come back. Now, feel free to ask tough questions though. So you can see how over a period of time, our emotions go up and down. There can be all kinds of characteristics about this sort of emotions, how our emotions change. And in psychology, they do measure these sort of things, except they ask people, how do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel all the time? And then you sort of get at things like, well, where is your home base? What is your recovery rate, rise rate, all sorts of things they've talked about. And so as you can guess from where this is going, asking people all the time is an intensive work, and you don't have big data sets that way. And we know another window into emotions is through our words. And I already said people are not very good at recalling how they felt in the past, right? So looking at natural language text, let's say, or social media feed and things like that, and getting at these emotion dynamics metrics seems like a very interesting prospect to do. So we did a bunch of work in that space and like characterizing these sort of features about emotion dynamics. First, we explored fictional characters, safe area. Nobody gets really upset at you when you're talking about fictional characters. It's a good place to test out various theories. And then we looked at emotion dynamics in tweets from US and Canada. And we found, again, we're doing a lot of this at aggregate level. We're not saying you can calculate emotion dynamics of an individual and psychologically diagnose them and things like that. You don't find those things. There's a huge amount of variation. But you can find systematic differences at aggregate level. So if you compare Americans versus Canadians as a whole, you do find systematic differences in valence or dominance and their emotion arcs and these sort of characteristics out there. And in 2023, we did some work again with some psychology colleagues, Tiffany Chang especially, and we looked at how these emotion dynamics are linked with biosocial markers. I'll not get into that much right now because I want to talk about other things, and especially I want to talk about emotion granularity. And I want to quickly point out before I transition that emotion dynamics is looking at an individual emotion arc, but in emotion granularity, I'm going to talk about pairs of emotion arcs for the same person, but for different emotions, right? But first, let's understand what is this emotion granularity. How many here have heard of emotion granularity? That thing again. Yes, not very common. Okay. Lisa Barrett, the protagonist of our story, you remember I talked to her about her a bunch before. In 2001, she talked about this idea about emotion granularity or emotion differentiation, where she said that different people have different capabilities in terms of how systematically we use emotion words, right? So, for example, again, if we take Roman and my example again, Roman might be very systematic. If he feels angry, he will use anger. If he feels annoyed, he will say annoyed.
Absolutely.
Right? But or happy and elated and excited. But let's say I, on the other hand, have a general sense I'm not feeling good. And then sometimes I'll say I'm feeling angry, sometimes I'm feeling sad for similar contexts, right? So then you say Roman has higher emotion granularity, using the emotion terms more precisely, while I have lower emotion granularity. And this is not a binary 0-1 thing. This is a spectrum thing. We're all on that spectrum somewhere, right? So emotion granularity is this ability of doing this systematically. And why does this matter? Turns out, since 2010 especially, there's been a whole bunch of work talking about how there's a link between emotion granularity and mental health and physical health and behavior, right? So depression, anxiety things, cardiovascular health, maladaptive behavior, lashing out at people, overeating, all of these things have been tied to better or worse emotion granularity. If you have worse emotion granularity, as in you have a general sense, but you're using words somewhat randomly about what they mean, this cohort of people tends to have poorer health outcomes. Roman's cohort, better health outcomes, right? So this is very interesting from a perspective about how emotion granularity, this thing about how we are constructing emotions in our head, how we are calling them, has a direct role in so many health aspects, right? Okay, so our work in this, again, sort of following the pattern from before, is that rather than asking people all the time, do you feel angry? Do you feel annoyed? Do you feel sadness? And trying to get emotional granularity from that, we wanted to look at, can we get at this metric of emotion granularity just from social media feeds? So we know what you've been saying for a long period of time. From that, can we see that what are the whether you are co-endorsing multiple emotions at the same time, or you're using emotion words very systematically. And more than that, we can look not just at denotational emotion where people are saying I'm sad or I'm angry. We can also see whether they are using connotative words, right? So are you using sadness associated words at the same time as anger associated words, or you're using them very systematically and in different contexts? So again, it helps us get at whether you're using these terms systematically or not. So we computed these emotion granularity metrics from various emotion arcs. So for example, you can take, let's say, the anger and sadness emotion arc, and you can see what is the correlation between these emotion arcs, right? Because the higher the correlation, it means in the same context, you're using both anger words and sadness words. The lower correlation means you're using them in different contexts, right? And some amount of correlation is fine. It's all a matter of relatively with the various other people where you stand. So in this work, which was, I must say, which was also led by Kirsten, not led, but KP was the lead author. She's a University of Toronto student, and she's now working at NRC. But I got into this work because I met Mallory Feldman, who was a grad student at UNC Chapel Hill in the psychology department, and she told me about how emotional analogy is so big in that field. And so if we want to do some NLP work, we should work on that. And Kirsten is her advisor, a fantastic affective science researcher on her own, right? And both of them have worked earlier with Lisa Feldman Barrett as well. So really great to be able to work with them. And so in this work, not only did we calculate the emotion granularity, we also showed that, if you look at tweets where people have self-disclosed that they have been diagnosed with PTSD, ADHD, depression, and so on, then their language tends to have, as a cohort, as a whole, that group tends to have lower emotional granularity than the control group where they have not disclosed this. Okay, so the final thing in this emotion arc thing is about the body work, which actually I'm even more excited about more recently, because it seems kind of weird to talk about body in some ways in these things, but it turned out to be fun, and this is a paper in submission, as I said. So this is with Sophie Wu and Jan Philip Wall. The paper is called Language of Interoception, Examining Embodiment Emotion through a Corpus of Body Part Mentions. And the reason I got into this work is over a period of a decade, I think. Actually, so soon after I created the emotion lexicon, Peter Turney, my colleague then, told me about this connection between the body and the emotions. Like in different cultures, different organs are associated with different emotions. And he also talked to me about George Lakoff's embodiment theories and things like that. And so looking at body, he said, was interesting. But it took me a while to get into it. And during this time, I was just steadily seeing this more and more work connecting our body with our brain and mind and emotions. Right? And this work has come from various fields, from medicine, psychology, affective science, philosophy, cognitive science, all sorts of places people are looking and learning how big a role our body is playing in our well-being and mind and how we perceive the world around us. And there are lots of theories involved in this thing, right? So like the embodiment theory, which says that our physical body and its interactions with the world are fundamental to our cognitive processes, emotions, and experiences. These are not separate. There are also theories of conceptual metaphors, the Lakoff and Johnson thing, where we know that abstract concepts are mapped to concrete source domains to enhance our understanding of things. So for example, we say grasp, to mean a physical act, to mean to understand. So understanding is an abstract concept, but we've used this metaphor from an abstract concept, from a concrete concept, to make understanding of this abstract concept easier. And what is interesting is that in many of these cases, the source domain from where we get these things tends to be our body, our movement, and space. And so the body is playing a big role there. So as Sophie put it, body part mentions offer a rich entry point into conceptual metaphor, and studying them can help how language encodes embodiment of thought. Right? But there are more theories. So there's mindfulness theories that talk about how being aware of the present, including your body, can be very good for us. The theory of constructed emotion, which I talked about, which also has a role for the body, playing a role in how we construct our emotions. And there are all kinds of theories about interoception, which we talked about earlier as well, where they talk about how if you have better interoception, you tend to have better physical and mental health, including all of these nice qualities, better emotion regulation, and so on. And so they would do experiments like, they would take people and say, tell me what is your resting heart rate, for example, right? So that's an internal body signal. And they found that the cohort of people who are better able to guess their resting heart rate tend to have better health outcomes. So there's this interesting idea that the more you're aware of these signals coming from your body, the better off you are. So to me, I thought this was fascinating. And being again in NLP, I thought, can we use language to shed light into this connection between the body and the mind, right? And it starts off with even basic questions. To what extent do we even talk about our body in language? And how do we talk about it with respect to various emotions? When we talk about our body, are those sentences more emotional than non-body referring sentences? Which emotions are certain emotions tied more to certain body parts? When you talk about certain body parts, are they more? This seems like fun and so interesting. So we did this work. And before I get into this, I'll just show you some examples. Here are some examples of people talking about body parts, for example. Perfectly straightforward. But BPMs, for short, body part mentions, they can also abstractly refer to a person's body, like in these examples. Or they can be used as metaphor and not referring to a specific person's body. And you can also have fossilized weak metaphorical connections, like in these sentences, right? So again, this is very interesting because everyday use of body part mentions can now be used to look at the study, not just between the body and mind, but also to look at how natural language is connected to this sort of physical world in which it originates, and this embodiment aspect. So we had a bunch of questions. I'll go a little faster, and we are 10 here. Turns out we tend to use body part mentions about 5 to 10% of the times in our language. Depends on how you count things and all that. But it's much higher than I thought. When I first thought about it, I thought it would be like 0.001% of the time. Because we talk about a lot of things. But turns out we talk about body parts a lot. And it's consistent across different domains. There are many questions. I'll just show you some things here. Here it shows you, if you look at it from January to December, the systematic trends. In spring, summer months, we talk about our body more. In December, we talk about it less. Does it matter by workday? Yes. Weekends, we are not talking about our body parts much, but in the middle of the week, we are talking about it more. Do individuals in different regions refer to their bodies in different frequencies? Canada versus US, you think it will be different?
Yes.
Yes. That's how it is different. So this is Canadians, 2015 to 2021, markedly lower than Americans, in the same years. Here is American cities, and you can see East Coast and West Coast, lower talk about body part mentions than central cities. So there's some systematic differences. We also looked at some, these emotion questions that I know, this is hard to see, but the gist of it is sentences with body part mentions tend to be more emotional, even though we don't use body part mentions. Those terms are removed from the emotion lexicons, where we're talking about the co-occurring words, but they tend to be more emotional when you have body part mentions. And different body parts are associated with different emotions. So my stomach, for example, so we also looked at like my body part mention because we want to look at people describing their body part, not somebody else's. My stomach more associated with sadness, my chest more associated with anger. In general, we found that high frequency BPMs were associated with more negative emotions. And so a natural question then was to ask, is talking about your body more, is that associated with good health, bad health, or has no correlation with health? And going into it, I had two theories. One is that, well, if you're talking about your health body more, maybe your back's paining or your head is aching or things like that. So maybe it is more it's related to poor health. On the other hand, I thought people who have good interoception, people who know their body well, might be expected to talk about their body more. And so if that's the case, then talking about your body more might be associated with better health and things like that, right? On the other hand, we don't really know what portion of the text of BPMs is associated with these two categories. Maybe we talk about the body parts in all sorts of other contexts, and that is in some sort of hidden way communicating health in some way or not associated with health at all. Okay, enough suspense. What we found was that high proportion use of body parts was associated with poorer health outcomes, and strongly so. And it was associated with poorer mental health and poorer physical health as well. And again, this is aggregate level entries. This is not about an individual. You'll not get that. There's a lot of variation. But if you take various cities in the US for which this data was done, we find that at an aggregate level, the more the proportion of body parts being mentioned in tweets from the city, the poorer the health outcomes from there. And so as comparison, we have, if you just take number of tweets, is that correlated? No, it's not correlated. It's not expected to. It's a sanity check. What if you take fear words in that? Or what if you take anger words or joy words and sadness words? We have different categories. Fear was the most indicative, but it's not that much more than random. And if you take proportion of, and we also did, if you just take body part mentions or you look at sentences where they said my body part and do that, there wasn't much of a difference. So these are both, essentially, if body parts are mentioned, and if you count up this proportion, that's a good indicator of poorer health at an aggregate level. Right. So to summarize this part, body part mentions are quite common. They can be used to study all kinds of things. So we hope to look at more into this embodiment aspect and things like that. But turns out it's a good indicator of health as well. This work was only done for English. We really should be doing this for many different languages to draw broader conclusions onto what this means and things like that. But the earlier thing also ties well to what we saw earlier. Canadians tend to have better health than Americans, and so that reflects with that lower BPM usage than them. And also the day of the week, there are more health outcomes have been reported in mid-week than in earlier week. And so there are a lot of things that suggest these sort of things are tying up with. Yeah.
So clarification question from the whole too. So when you talk about, when you talk about those results, how is how are those health categories measured? Are these like reports from the cities or
Yes.
reports from the cities? Okay.
This is reports from the cities. So there is good information in the US from various cities at aggregate level.
Thanks.
All right, final thing, I'll go quick, I promise. Let's talk a little bit about the ethical considerations in emotion recognition. Often when people talk about ethics things, they talk about data sets or they talk about evaluations, but it's important to recognize that this envelops the whole life cycle of doing any sort of work. And especially important, I think, is in the defining of the task or the designing of the task. So if you take emotion recognition, some people might say it means inferring the emotions felt by a speaker. But there are really all sorts of ways in which we can define this task, right? So here are some. So for example, you can say inferring emotions of the speaker as perceived by a reader or listener. The speaker has said something, but the listener is now perceiving that this speaker feels this particular emotion or not. Or you might be interested in inferring emotions that the speaker is attempting to convey. That's something else. Or you might be interested in inferring emotions evoked in the reader, inferring emotions of people mentioned in the text, or inferring whether what is described in this particular text is good or bad for something that I care about. That's quite different. But it's also the way, a lot of industry people think about sentiment analysis, right? So they care about, this person said this. Are they going to vote for my candidate? Or do they like my product? That's what they care about. They don't care about whether you're happy or sad. That's the kind of sentiment analysis they want, right? So there are all kinds of ways in which you can define emotion recognition as a task. Just always be aware of that. And then think about, if you are working in the space, what is a particular design or definition that you want to work with? Because all of these come with benefits, potential harms, and ethical considerations. And if you go back to this slide that I had earlier, we don't want to say that just by looking at your facial expression, we can figure out whether you are angry or sad, or just by looking your some text that you wrote, I can know whether you are a genuine refugee claimant or not, whether you really fear for your life or not. You don't want to use automatic systems in things like that. It just does not make sense, right? And remember that companies will want to build anything that they can sell. It does not matter whether there is good science behind it or not, whether there's lots of variability or not. If they can sell a product to somebody, they will sell it. And so it's important for us to give the right signals when we do our work on emotion recognition or any other space, so that people don't draw wrong conclusions from that, right? So emotion recognition can be a powerful tool and help unlock all these interesting things about our behavior, emotions, evolution, and things like that. But it can also be used as a tool for substantial harm. And we know cases of mass application on vulnerable populations, unreliable approaches, perpetuation of physiognomy, and things like that. So in 2020, I was thinking a whole lot about it, and I wrote up this work first as a blog post and then as the CL Journal article. So I'm very happy CL Journal accepted it. Roman, thank you again for your comments on an earlier draft of that work. It was very helpful. And after that, so that was for emotion recognition, but I also created this sort of slide street. Yeah, now it shows the whole thing. I also created a version where I created a template of 50 ethical considerations. So no matter which task you are working on, this can be a guide to think about, here are the various issues that you think about, and to write about the ethical consideration for the task of your interest. So you're all doing great work. If you see that in your space, people have not talked about the ethical considerations for that particular task, I encourage you to write some things about it. And last but not least, I want to say that in the last couple of years, I've been especially interested in working on languages other than English, because most of NLP research is on English. And so in 2023, there was a shared task on sentiment analysis, where we had 14 languages, all from Africa, from 3 different language families. That was great. And this year at ACL, we'll be having the shared task on emotions, and we had 35 languages from all around the world. And it was a crazy team effort with like 40 shared task organizers. I vow never to do such a big thing again. but it was great to be able to create these resources for all these other languages. Right? All right, with that, I'll end. Thank you for your patience. You've been great, and I appreciate your questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. We have 15 minutes for